Hello Internet! I'm not going to do a big and involved video today because what I really wanted to talk about was my, speciality, which is military history. And in particularly, I wanted to tell you all about some of my favorite generals, and more specifically what makes them my favorite generals. This isn't going to be a long and involved biography of either of them. It's basically going to be a fairly short video because I'm really busy at work these days, so I don't have time to do as much research as I would have liked to do, or really as much time to shoot as I would have liked to have. But basically where I take a list of 10 of my favorite generals throughout history and why I think these are really important and should be studied by anyone who has any interest in military history. So yeah, enjoy. The first is Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, and he is fairly interesting in this because he really only is known to have run a single military campaign in 458 BC, so he was even before Alexander and some of the other really great generals, and clearly the earliest example on my list. The story goes that he had been driven into poverty after his son had murdered a political rival, and the son had been executed, and Cincinnatus had to pay the blood money for the son's victim. However, on his little farm outside the city, he was eventually met by representatives from the Senate who declared him emperor because the Roman field army had been ambushed by the Aquii, another Latin people that Rome were fighting at the time, and was besieged on a mountain. Cincinnati immediately entered the town, took over every single aspect of governance, raised a new army, marched to the succor of the Roman besieged army, broke the Aquii lines, forged a peace treaty, returned to Rome, disbanded his army, and returned to his farm, all in a span of 15 days. Now, how much of this is actually true? We don't know. There are clear parallels to other similar situations throughout Roman history. Why I like Cincinnatus is his influence on the Roman history. He was the paragon, the epitome of what successful Roman generals and public servants wanted to be. He was truly the paragon of Roman public virtues. And for that, just the influence he had on the Roman world, and through that the influence he's had on all the Western world later, he clearly deserves a list, or a place on my list of favorite generals. Next we have Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest enemy, the immensely successful Carthaginian general who famously brought his army and a contingent of war elephants from Spain through France across the Alps into Italy, defeated the Romans on very many occasions, and in a 10-year span actually held more of Roman territory than Rome did. In the end, he was basically only defeated due to the fact that the Carthaginians could not successfully get him resupplied or rearmed, and the Romans, having defeated the Carthaginians at sea, managed to launch a sort of invasion of the Carthaginians' native lands, so Hannibal had to rush home with whatever army forces he could get to defend his city, where he then lost. What Hannibal was really important about is that his strategic vision, he was a phenomenal tactical successful general, as seen particularly in the Battle of Cannae and various others, where he trounced the Romans. But it was his strategic vision that allowed him to outmaneuver, outfight, and basically flummox the Romans for nearly 15 years of war. And more specifically, he forced the Romans to adapt to him. All the Romans' military tactics after his days were basically developed not so much from their own initiative, but basically as a response to Hannibal. So again, he was in some ways also the cause for Roman military successes that created the later empire. For that alone, for his personal nobility, for his civil accomplishments after the Second Punic War, he is one of my favorite generals and someone who deserves to be studied by any student of the field. Next is a man not much known in the West. And I'm cheating a bit because Yi Sun-sin, a Korean commander, was not actually a general. He was an admiral fighting against the Japanese in the Imjin War during the late 16th century. He was an exemplary gentleman, apparently both off and on the battlefield, and was, quite frankly, with a few possible rivals, the greatest naval commander this world has probably ever seen, particularly in the Battle of Myeonggyang, and I apologize to any Koreans who had to suffer through me trying to pronounce that, where he had about 13 warships to 133 Japanese because of bunglings by some of his rivals at a previous battle. He managed to fight the Japanese to a crushing defeat, destroying more than 100 of the Japanese ships without losing a single one of his own. He constantly won basically every battle he was involved with, and even when his rivals at some time managed to get him thrown out of his position and even imprisoned and tortured, when it was realized that those rivals were incompetent, he immediately returned back, won the said battle, and continued to fight to drive the Japanese out of the occupation they have had of parts of southern Korea. In fact, his death in battle coincided with the final battle where the Japanese army was completely expelled from the Korean peninsula and returned to Japan, where he was mortally wounded by a bullet, and apparently said, "The battle is still in fighting, do not announce my death until it's over." And yeah, not much to say. He was primarily interesting because, like I said, of his complete success in naval conflict, and because of he understood how to beat his enemy. He developed new technologies specifically to fight the Japanese where they were weak. And again, his loyalty to his cause, to his people, to his country, despite the lack of loyalty from them to him, is spectacular. We go to the obligatory Danish Viking ruler on the list, more specifically Svend Forkbeard, King of Denmark, Norway, parts of Sweden, and conqueror of England. As a king, he was fairly successful in his realms, but what makes him interesting as a general was that he was probably more than anyone the man who first combined Viking military tactics with a more Western European style, which sort of allowed him to use the best of both worlds to create an army that was very, very, very hard to beat regarding whatever foes he was fighting. It was a time where the Viking forces were starting to being beat back by their enemies because the enemies have more or less tagged on to their tactics. So Svend's adoption of several Western European styles to the specific Viking military tactics was a very impressive military feat, and it was that which allowed him to conquer England in the last few years of his life. He is not ordinarily known as a great general and probably won't appear on any great generals list amongst various historians, but try to check out what is known about his military exploits, at least after he had become king, and you will see how he was, again, a very successful general, politician, and just all over effective leader, military and otherwise. Ulysses Grant. Now here is a man I feel is often, at least in the general public, severely underrated. The Supreme General of the Northern States of America during the last years of the Civil War, and before that a incredibly successful general in the Western theater, later in my opinion, supremely underestimated American president. Grant was, in my opinion, the first real modern general. Now, most people, when they think of Civil War generals on, top 10 list, would at least mention someone like Lee or Stonewall Jackson or Sherman or various others, and I agree, and those will probably feature in a later video if I decide to return to this subject. But Grant was basically the man who, more than anyone, in my opinion, understood how war had changed. It was no longer a matter of capturing cities or, for that matter, to have one big final battle that would then decide everything. No, this was about crushing enemy armies, no matter what it took. And basically, he pitted his resolve and strategic calm against Lee's genius, and in the end, by utilizing his resources in the correct fashion, he came out on top. At the same time, if anyone studies his Western campaigns, they can tell that he was actually a fairly aggressive general and a fairly successful aggressive general who truly understood how to use his army to achieve the best results. Grant is one of my favorite Americans of all time, and I invite anyone to try to study him and both his military and civilian life. He was very, very, very interesting and one of history's great generals, even if people don't necessarily always think of him like that. Well, Napoleon Bonaparte. What can I say about this man that has not already been said? More books and more studies have probably been done on him and his reign of France and his military career than about anyone else in modern times, and I will refrain from trying to add to that because I believe a lot of them are very, very good and say everything that needs to be said. What I like about Napoleon was that he basically invented the modern way of structuring the military. He basically invented, shall we say, the combined warfare of several, not just having the infantry move forward and the cavalry just doing its own thing, maybe supporting it, maybe fighting their own battle, and the artillery doing that. He basically invented the concept of all kinds of arms working together to achieve the results. His early campaigns were some of the most brilliant ever in the world, and even after 1807, when he basically seemed to have lost some of his military touch, or his opponents had perhaps read him to a certain degree, he continued to be one of the most skillful, inventive, and brilliant generals of all time. I hold not that much actual respect for Napoleon the man. Napoleon the ruler was a fairly efficient kind of guy that I at least think most of the stuff he did was worthy of being studied and emulated. Napoleon the man, no, not so much, but Napoleon the general, easily one of the greatest military minds of all times, and yeah, there is no way anyone can do a study of military history and get around Napoleon. He was brilliant. Watch his particular study, the Austerlitz campaign, for instance. That is probably his masterpiece, or maybe Jena a few years later. Those just, yeah, wow. Read up on this man. Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman. Definitely the last great Roman, or at least Western Roman military commander, but also probably the last Roman who truly embodied the virtues that had categorized the Roman civilization in its 1,000-year history. He was a general in around 430 to 450 AD, and he was the man who organized the tribes of Western Europe and the last remaining Roman legions to defeat Attila the Hun's invasion of France in 453, defeating him at Chalon-sur-Marne in what has been described as the biggest battle ever in history until modern times. He basically was the man who created and held together the sort of tribal alliance that allowed for Western Europe not to descend into chaos during the Hunnish invasions and Roman impotence of the time. He held together literally the Roman court under a succession of incompetent emperors, and before his murder he was again the most influential man in Western Rome at the time. Again, several other people might have been equal to him throughout history, but just a man like that arising at a time of utter chaos, utter confusion, and utter incompetency amongst the Roman leadership and becoming so successful is someone that I can truly admire, truly appreciate, and truly believe is worth studying by all. Go read up on this man. He is very, very, very important, and not enough know about him. With the focus there has been on Rome, it cannot surprise anyone that I would eventually arrive at the divine Julius, the first sort of Roman commander in late Republican and early Imperial times to be made a god after his death. Caesar was a candidate, or is a candidate still, for most successful and most important military commander of all time. He basically created the Roman Empire from his life and his deeds. And while Caesar wasn't perhaps actually the most, shall we say, inventive, or how to put it, innovative military commander, he is on this list maybe the man who was best at just about everything. He can probably measure up to anyone else on the list in everything. So he might not have been the best at everything, but overall he just had the whole package. He was a brilliant siege master. He was a tactical genius, a strategical mastermind, a political, very successful diplomat and ruler. He just had it all. I don't, again, like Napoleon, I don't need to say a lot about Caesar because everyone knows about him, or at least everyone who has any interest in history should know about him. But again, even if you don't, keep reading up on this man. Read up on his wars in Gaul. It was propaganda, and he wrote it to raise his own political profile. But just read up on him. Read up on his Battle of Alesia, which was a strategic tactical mastery just almost never seen again. Caesar is one of my favorite generals for a reason, and one of the greatest generals ever for a reason. Next is my favorite unknown general, at least a general not very familiar in the general public, though if anything I would hope to change this with, well, not my spectacular internet reach, but someone I would really want people to know about. Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's great dogs of war, leader of the Mongol vanguard at its height, the man Genghis Khan trusted to lead independent campaigns against his foes when he himself was busy elsewhere. Subutai fought more than 60 successful battles, conquered more than 30 nations, and led more than 20 campaigns in his year. He was supreme general of both Genghis and his son and successor Udogai, and led the invasion of Eastern Europe that resulted in the crushing of both the Hungarian and Polish armies on successive days more than 300 miles apart. That was Subutai. He would probably have invaded Western Europe after this, and it is doubtful whether any forces could really have united to stop him at this particular time if Udogai hadn't died and he had been forced to return to Mongolia for the election of the next great Khan. But he conquered probably more territory than anyone else in the history of mankind, and he was, many feel it is rumored, the real genius behind Genghis Khan's military exploits. So, yeah, probably, in fact, the greatest general of all time, and certainly the greatest and most successful general anyone has ever heard of. Go read up on Subutai, even if it's only just his Wikipedia entry. It is very interesting. There is a lot of blood, there's a lot of spilled brains, there's a lot of torture of fools, and basically just a litany of military successful victories using the most important and experienced tactics ever devised by light cavalry troops. Subutai, great man. Finally, one of my biggest heroes of all time, Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, a British general who first made his name fighting the various tribes of India and basically completing the British conquest of India that the great Clive had initiated 60 years prior. Wellington was eventually appointed to lead the British military campaign against the French in occupied Spain. He was probably the first general during the Napoleonic Wars who dared take on French generals without any kind of fear or trepidation whatsoever. He used his military tactics spectacularly to oppose whatever general was in front of him, adapting to whatever tactics was thrown against him. He's often known as a cautious and, shall we say, defensively minded general, and that was true mainly because he almost always fought on the defensive against hugely superior French numbers. But look at his Salamanca campaign, his Vittoria campaign. Hell, even look at what he did at the invasion of France, how he crossed the various river lines that Soult was trying to throw up against him. Later in life, of course, Wellington became a conservative Prime Minister of England, and while there can be some debate about his political means, there can be very little doubt that he was one of the greatest military commanders of all times. He never lost a battle. Facing Napoleon at Waterloo, he won. Facing everyone he ever faced, he won. He might be the only military commander in history to have never really actually lost a pitched battle ever. Again, with the possible exception of Yi Sun Sin, as mentioned earlier. Wellington is one of my great heroes. His personality, his military style, just everything speaks a lot to me. Anyone who hasn't read some of the great biographies about Wellington, go do it now. He is amazing. Well, that was it. As you can see, this was a short little video without much script, mostly me just rambling about military commanders I really like throughout history. If there is any interest in it, I might return to this subject at another time. As for now, I will continue going to work and trying to get money to keep this channel going. So yeah, until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.